The poker chips scattered across the saloon floor like autumn leaves as Margaret Sullivan's trembling hand swept them from the table. The sudden crash of ceramic and metal against weathered wood cut through the thick tobacco smoke and raucous laughter that had filled Hartwell's saloon moments before. Every weathered face turned toward the doorway where she stood, her usually pristine blue dress now stained with dust from the long ride into town, her auburn hair disheveled and escaping from its carefully pinned arrangement. Jake Morrison's confident smile faltered as he looked up from his winning hand, the cards still clutched in his manicured fingers. The son of Sheriff Morrison had been regaling the crowd with tales of his latest business ventures, his voice carrying the arrogant tone that came with knowing his father's badge protected him from consequence. But something in Margaret's wild eyes made his throat constrict, made the whiskey he'd been savoring turn bitter on his tongue. Well, Jake drawled, forcing his smile back into place as he slowly rose from his chair. If it isn't the lovely Mrs. Sullivan. Thomas finally let you out of that big house of his? The other men chuckled nervously, sensing an undercurrent they couldn't quite identify. Margaret's husband Thomas was one of the most respected ranchers in 3 counties, his wife known for her quiet dignity and charitable works. Seeing her here, in this den of gambling and drinking, was like witnessing a preacher's daughter dancing with the devil. Margaret's chest heaved with each labored breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The memory of 3 months ago crashed over her like a flash flood in the desert, vivid and merciless. She could still feel the rough wooden planks of the barn floor against her back, still smell the mixture of hay and Jake's sickening cologne, still hear his whispered threats about what would happen to her 6-year-old son Timothy if she ever spoke a word of what he'd done to her while Thomas was away selling cattle in San Antonio. The iron brand had been the worst part, worse even than the violation itself. Jake had heated it in the forge behind her own barn, pressing the glowing metal against the tender flesh of her thighs while she screamed into the gag he'd fashioned from her own petticoat. The letters J and M, his initials, burned into her skin like a rancher marks his cattle. Property. That's what he'd called her as he'd done it. Now you'll never forget who you really belong to, Margaret. And every time your husband touches you, you'll remember me. You look a little peaked, Mrs. Sullivan, Jake continued, his voice carrying false concern but his eyes glittering with something darker. Perhaps you should head home. I'm sure Thomas is wondering where his precious wife has gotten to. He emphasized the word precious with a cruel twist of his lips that made Margaret's stomach lurch. The saloon had grown eerily quiet, the usual sounds of cards shuffling and glasses clinking replaced by an expectant hush. Even old Pete, the piano player who never stopped his tinkling melodies, had lifted his gnarled fingers from the keys. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hutch who'd seen every kind of drama unfold in his establishment, carefully set down the glass he'd been polishing and reached beneath the bar where he kept his shotgun. Margaret stepped further into the saloon, her boots clicking against the wooden floor with the measured pace of someone walking to their own execution. She could see her reflection in the mirror behind the bar, fractured by a crack that ran diagonally across the glass. Half of her face looked normal, the respectable rancher's wife she'd always been. The other half was distorted, strange, like the woman she'd become since that terrible afternoon in her own barn. I need to tell you all something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. The Mexican guitarist in the corner stopped mid-strum, his dark eyes fixed on her with growing concern. Even the saloon girls, usually immune to drama after years of witnessing human nature at its worst, had paused in their card dealing and drink serving to stare at this refined woman who looked so utterly out of place among the rough cowboys and gamblers. Jake's jaw tightened, and he took a step toward her, his hand instinctively moving to the pearl-handled Colt at his hip. Now, Mrs. Sullivan, I think you've had a bit too much sun today. Why don't you let me escort you home? I'm sure your husband wouldn't want you making a spectacle of yourself in front of all these gentlemen. He gestured dismissively at the crowd, but his voice carried an unmistakable threat that made several of the more perceptive patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret's laugh came out as something between a sob and a shriek, a sound so raw and broken that it made the hardened cowboys around her exchange worried glances. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind during the long, sleepless nights when Thomas lay snoring beside her, oblivious to the way she flinched whenever he tried to touch her. She'd imagined walking into this very saloon, facing down her tormentor, speaking the truth that had been burning in her throat like acid for 3 months. But now, standing here in the suffocating atmosphere of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies, feeling Jake's predatory gaze trying to intimidate her back into silence, Margaret realized that no amount of rehearsal could have prepared her for this moment. Her hands shook so violently that she had to press them against her skirts to still them, the fabric rough beneath her palms, so different from the silk and lace she'd once taken for granted. "You want to know why I'm really here?" she asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. The tears that had been threatening finally began to fall, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "You want to know why the respectable Mrs. Sullivan is standing in Hartwell's saloon instead of at home preparing supper for her husband and son?" The tension in the room was palpable now, thick as the summer heat that pressed against the windows. Even the flies seemed to have stopped their buzzing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Jake's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his right hand now rested openly on his gun handle, though he was careful not to draw it in front of so many witnesses. Margaret could see Thomas's foreman, Carlos, sitting at a table near the back, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing alarm. He'd worked for her family for 15 years, had watched her son take his first steps, had always treated her with the respectful deference due to his employer's wife. Now he was leaning forward in his chair, his own hand moving toward the knife he kept sheathed at his side, sensing violence in the air even if he didn't understand its source. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jake said again, his voice now carrying the hard edge of someone whose patience was wearing thin. "I really must insist that you allow me to escort you home. This isn't the place for a lady, and you're clearly not yourself today." He took another step toward her, close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow where his horse had kicked him as a boy. That scar had been one of the details that had haunted her dreams, that small imperfection that made his face memorable even when she desperately wanted to forget it. She'd traced it with her eyes while he'd held her down, while he'd whispered all the terrible things he was going to do to her, while the brand heated in the forge just a few feet away. Margaret reached for the hem of her dress, her fingers trembling as they found the fabric. This was it. The moment that would change everything, that would shatter the careful facade she'd built around her life like a stone through glass. Once she did this, there would be no going back, no pretending that Margaret Sullivan was still the same woman who'd baked pies for church socials and read bedtime stories to her son. The saloon held its collective breath as her fingers began to lift the heavy material of her skirt. The fabric of Margaret's dress rose inch by agonizing inch, revealing first her worn leather boots, then the rough cotton stockings that had seen better days. The silence in Hartwell's saloon had become so complete that the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer 3 buildings away seemed to echo like thunder. Jake Morrison's face had drained of all color, his hand now gripping his pistol so tightly that his knuckles had turned white as bleached bone. "Don't," he whispered, but his voice carried across the room like a gunshot. "Margaret, don't do something you'll regret." But Margaret was beyond threats now, beyond fear, beyond the careful calculations that had kept her silent for 3 months. The hem of her dress continued its relentless journey upward, past her ankles, past her calves, until the scarred flesh of her thighs became visible in the dim lamplight of the saloon. The branded letters J and M stood out like accusations against her pale skin, the flesh still pink and puckered from the healing process, the lines crude but unmistakable. A collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd, followed by a silence so profound that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Carlos, Thomas's foreman, was the first to understand what he was seeing. His weathered face contorted with rage as he shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward to the floor. "Dios mío," he breathed, his accent thick with emotion. "What kind of animal?" Jake's gun cleared its holster in a fluid motion, the barrel swinging toward Carlos before anyone could react. "Sit down, old man. This doesn't concern you." But the damage was done. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, visible and undeniable. Margaret let her dress fall back into place, her legs shaking so badly that she had to grip the nearest table for support. The tears were flowing freely now, 3 months of suppressed anguish pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. "He came to my ranch while Thomas was in San Antonio," she said, her voice cracking but growing stronger with each word. "Said he had business to discuss about water rights. I invited him in for coffee, like any Christian woman would do for a neighbor. She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. I was such a fool. Such a trusting, stupid fool. Jake's pistol never wavered, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air drifting through the saloon's swinging doors. She's lying, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Look at her. She's clearly lost her mind. Probably been drinking laudanum again. I've never taken laudanum in my life, Margaret shot back, her green eyes blazing with an inner fire that made several men step back involuntarily. But you know what I have done, Jake Morrison? I've lived with your mark burned into my flesh for 3 months. I've felt those letters every time I walked, every time I sat down, every time I tried to forget what you did to me in my own barn. The Mexican guitarist, a man named Eduardo who'd worked various saloons throughout Texas, slowly reached for the rifle he kept beside his stool. He'd seen enough violence in his 40 years to recognize the signs, and the way Jake's gun hand was trembling told him that blood was about to be spilled. The saloon girls had retreated to the far corners of the room, their painted faces pale with fear. Old Pete, the piano player, cleared his throat nervously. Now, Jake, maybe you should put that gun away. This is between you and the lady. There is no between anything, Jake snarled, his composure finally cracking. This woman is clearly deranged. Everyone knows how these rancher wives get lonely when their husbands are away. She probably did this to herself for attention. The suggestion was so outrageous that even the hardened gamblers and cowboys in the saloon recoiled. Carlos took a step forward despite the gun pointed at him, his dark eyes burning with righteous fury. No woman brands herself with another man's initials, you piece of filth. Margaret straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Tell them about the barn, Jake. Tell them how you held me down on the hay while you heated that iron in the forge. Tell them what you whispered in my ear while you burned your initials into my skin like I was nothing more than livestock. Jake's gun swung back toward her, and for a moment the entire saloon balanced on the edge of violence. But before he could speak, the batwing doors swung open with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. Sheriff Morrison stepped inside, his badge glinting in the lamplight, his own hand resting on the butt of his service revolver. What's all the commotion about? The sheriff asked, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a lawman. He saw his son with a drawn weapon, saw the tears on Margaret Sullivan's face, saw the way every other man in the saloon was poised for violence. Jake, put that gun away before someone gets hurt. Pa, she's lying about me, Jake said, but his voice had the desperate edge of a cornered animal. She's trying to ruin my reputation with her crazy stories. Sheriff Morrison was a corrupt man, everyone in town knew that, but he wasn't stupid. He'd seen enough evidence in his years of law enforcement to recognize the truth when it was staring him in the face. The way his son was sweating, the way his gun hand shook, the raw pain in Margaret Sullivan's eyes, it all painted a picture he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. Mrs. Sullivan, the sheriff said carefully, these are serious accusations you're making. They're not accusations, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her cheeks. They're facts. Your son violated me in my own home, then branded me like an animal to ensure my silence. He threatened to kill my boy if I ever told anyone what he'd done. The sheriff's face went gray as ash. He'd spent years covering up his son's smaller transgressions, paying off saloon girls who complained about rough treatment, making sure Jake's gambling debts disappeared, turning a blind eye to the way his boy treated anyone he considered beneath his station. But this was different. This was the wife of one of the most prominent ranchers in the county, making accusations that couldn't be swept under the rug or bought off with a few silver dollars. That's enough, Thomas Sullivan's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Margaret's husband stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his face a mask of cold fury that made every man in the saloon take a step back. He'd obviously ridden hard from the ranch, his clothes dusty and his usually perfectly groomed hair disheveled. I heard enough from outside. Margaret felt her knees buckle with relief and terror combined. Thomas had heard everything, had finally learned the truth she'd been too afraid and ashamed to tell him. She searched his face for some sign of what he was thinking, whether he blamed her for what had happened, whether their marriage could survive this revelation. "Thomas," she whispered, but he held up a hand to silence her, his gaze fixed entirely on Jake Morrison. "You branded my wife," Thomas said, his voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear it. "You violated her in our own home, then marked her like she was your property." Jake's gun swung toward Thomas, but the rancher was faster than anyone had expected. His own Colt appeared in his hand with the speed of a man who'd spent years defending his land from rustlers and hostile tribes. The two men faced each other across the saloon floor, weapons drawn, while Margaret stood between them like a fragile bridge spanning an unbridgeable chasm. "Put the guns down, both of you," Sheriff Morrison ordered, but neither man paid him any attention. "Your wife came to me," Jake said desperately, sweat now pouring down his face. "She wanted it. She begged me for it. Ask anyone in town, they'll tell you how she looks at men when you're not around." The lie was so obvious, so pathetically weak, that it actually made Thomas smile. It was not a pleasant expression. "Is that really the story you want to go with, Morrison? That my wife, who can barely stand to shake hands with the preacher, somehow seduced you into branding her with your initials?" Margaret realized that the entire saloon was watching this confrontation like spectators at a Roman gladiator match, and suddenly she understood that this moment would be talked about in Tombstone Ridge for decades to come. The night Margaret Sullivan revealed her scars and two men faced each other over her honor. The night that changed everything. "Thomas," she said, stepping forward despite the danger. "Don't do this. Don't let him make you into a murderer. He's not worth it." But Thomas's eyes never left Jake's face. "He marked you, Maggie. He burned his initials into your skin like you were his cattle. That's not something a man forgives." "And it's not something a woman forgets," Margaret replied, her voice strong and clear. "But I won't have his death on my conscience along with everything else. I won't let him take that from us too." The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, Jake's gun hand began to tremble more violently. The weight of every gaze in the room, the undeniable evidence of his crime, the knowledge that his father couldn't protect him from this, it all crashed down on him at once. "I was drunk," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean, she looked so pretty that day, and I just—" The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Even Sheriff Morrison closed his eyes in defeat, knowing that his son had just sealed his own fate. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger of his Colt, and Margaret held her breath, waiting for the shot that would end it all. But the shot never came. Instead, Thomas slowly lowered his weapon, his face etched with a pain deeper than any physical wound. "You're going to leave," he said quietly. "Tonight. You're going to ride out of Texas and never come back. If I ever see your face again, I'll kill you where you stand." Jake nodded frantically, holstering his weapon with shaking hands. Yes, I'll go. I'll leave tonight. And if you ever speak my wife's name again, to anyone, anywhere, I'll find you." Thomas's voice was as final as a coffin lid closing. "Count on it." As Jake stumbled toward the door, his father following behind with the defeated posture of a broken man, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe. The saloon remained silent until the sound of horses' hooves faded into the distance, carrying the Morrison men away from Tombstone Ridge forever. Then, slowly, the normal sounds of life began to return. Someone cleared their throat. A chair scraped against the floor. Old Pete tentatively struck a few notes on his piano. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, weathered cowboys, hardened gamblers, saloon girls with hearts bigger than their reputations, and realized that something fundamental had changed in this room tonight. She was no longer the untouchable rancher's wife on a pedestal. She was a woman who had suffered and survived, who had found the courage to speak her truth even when it cost her everything. Thomas moved to her side, not touching her but standing close enough that she could feel his strength. "Are you ready to go home, Maggie?" She nodded, wiping the last of her tears away with the back of her hand. "Yes. I'm ready to go home." As they walked toward the door together, Carlos fell into step beside them, his loyalty as steadfast as the sunrise. Other men nodded respectfully as they passed, and Margaret realized that she had gained something tonight that she'd never had before, the respect that comes not from social position or material wealth, but from having the courage to stand up and tell the truth when it mattered most. The night air outside the saloon was cool and clean, filled with the promise of a new beginning. Margaret Sullivan had entered Hartwell's saloon as a victim, but she was leaving as a survivor. And in a place where survival was the highest virtue, that made her something approaching a legend. Behind them, the saloon slowly returned to its normal rhythms, but everyone knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Some stories, once told, changed the very ground they're spoken on. And this was one of those stories.